right, so now we're ready for Chapter 5, Lesson 3. Now, Chapter 5, Lesson 3 just piggybacks onto what we did in yesterday's lesson in Chapter 5, Lesson 2. So in Lesson 2, we were looking at percents particularly, and how to change those into fractions or how to change those into decimals. Today's lesson mixes them all together. How can I be given 1 and interchangeably then get the other 2? Because if I'm given 1, then they automatically will equal the other 2. A fraction will always be able to be equal to a decimal and will always be equal to a percent. A percent can always equal a fraction and a decimal can always equal a fraction and a percent. So it's just going through the steps and processes, putting them all together, and recognizing that I can have 3 forms from 1 number. They give us a scenario to start with to figure out how to do that. Now, when we compare things, we talked about from the very beginning of the school year, when I have fractions, well, I have to have a common denominator. When I have decimals, I have to have decimal spaces. And then we looked at, well, if I have a fraction and a decimal, then I have to choose which one I'm going to do. And I told you then, if you like fractions, go with fractions. If you like decimals, go with decimals. It doesn't matter, because doing the math, that's the key. Do I understand how to change these numbers from one form to another? Same situation here. So it says, during the 2008-2009 season of the National Basketball Association, which is the NBA, the Phoenix Suns won about 11 out of 20 of their games. The Miami Heat won about 0.524, 524 thousandths of their games. Which team was more successful during the season? So I have a decimal and I have a fraction, so I needed to be able to compare. How are we going to compare them then? Well, if I can change those both into a form of themselves, then I should be able to compare them. So we're going to change both of them into a percentage. How do we do that? Well, we're going to start with the Suns with their 11/20th record. So when we talked about changing fractions into percents in the previous 2 lessons, then we talked about a percent is always out of what denominator or what whole? 100, right? So I know my first step is to get a denominator that is going to be equal to 100 for my 11/20ths. So if my denominator has to be equal to 11/20ths, and then I'm going to multiply my denominator and my numerator by the same number. So what is that number? Well, 20 times what equals 100? Because I have to get that 100 as my denominator. Well, if I multiply by 5s, I have my denominator multiplied by 5, therefore I have to multiply my numerator by 5. And 5 times 11 gives me, well, that's 55, right? So if I have my denominator as 100, then to give my percent, all I have to do is take that numerator and bring it down or set it to the side and add a percent sign behind it. So my numerator is 55, therefore I know I'm talking about 55%. That's always going to be my label. I'm always going to show a percent sign when I'm changing it into a percent. As I graded some of the 5.1 and 5.2 that were turned in, we left percent signs off. That's a label. I have to have a percent sign to get all the credit that I should have. So I know that the Suns won about 55% of all of their games. All right, so what about the next team? So when I look at the other team, they gave me a decimal. All right, so 0.524, 524 thousandths. How do I change that into a percentage? Well, I know that I'm going to have a decimal and I'm going to divide by 100. Well, dividing by 100, because I have a numerator and a denominator, right? My denominator is always out of 100. So if I go back to what we did in the previous lesson, for example, if I had 19%, we talked about, well, all I have to do is divide by 100, or I showed you the shortcut. And the shortcut to me is always going to be easier. To go from percent to decimal, I drop the percent sign, and then I move my decimal from right to left 2 times, right? So that would have been 9.919, which is 1900ths. So if I do that, have that in mind, then I know that this is just going to be the reverse process. Going from a percent into a decimal, I'm going to move from to left 2 times, so I'm starting with a decimal. How am I going to move to a percent? Well, then I would move from left to right 2 times. It's just reverse of what we did before. So if I have my decimal here, then to change it into my percent, I know I'm multiplying now by 100 instead of dividing by 100, because I'm going in the reverse order. And if that works, then I know I'm going to move to the right this time instead of to the left. And how many times? Well, 2 times, because I know I'm using 100 and there's 2 zeros on that 100. So I just move it once, I move it twice. That puts my decimal point right between the 2 and the 4. So I know I end up with 52.4%. All right, so if that's 52.4%, and I'm comparing it to the Suns who had 55%, who had the better season? Well, that'd be the Suns, right? So hopefully that makes sense in going through that process, but we're going to work through a couple more just so we know exactly what we're doing. This one says to write 0.7 as a fraction and as a percent. So this is showing you what your homework is going to be like, and then we'll practice some that look exactly like what your homework is going to look like. But this is telling us that we're going to be given 1, and we've got to come up with 2 answers. Remember, the decimal doesn't have a label, right? The fraction, it doesn't have a label. But the percent, if you're finding the percent as one of your 2 answers, it has to have the label with a percent sign. So I have 0.7. This says 0.7 means 7 what? Well, it means 7/10, right? So I need a denominator of 10. However, we're talking about percentages. I have to change it into a percent, and I need a denominator of what? I have to have a denominator of 100. So in order to get 100 from 10, that means I have to multiply it by 10. And if I multiply my denominator by 10, I have to multiply my numerator by 10. Ignore my children. That's their alarm. When I multiply my numerator by 10, then I get 70. And we said when I have a fraction with a denominator of 100, then that numerator is just going to be taken down and a percent sign is going to be added. So I know I'm going to keep my 70 and add a percent sign. So my first answer is 70%. So if 70% is my first answer, then, now notice I put a weight up there. What if, instead of going through this process to get to that answer, I just looked at it and said, okay, now we said that going from a decimal to a percent is just the opposite as going from a percent into a decimal, which we did in 5.2. So if I move that decimal 2 times to the right, because there's 2 zeros, and I'm going to the right because I'm multiplying, I get 70%. Is this easier? Well, in my opinion, it is. If it's not, you like this, then do that. Okay? But here's the thing. I had some of you doing this on 5.2 assignment, but you didn't show this step here. That's showing your work. That's what I said on the video on lesson 5.2, and I'm saying it on this video as well. This shows work. This gives you a point. If I don't see this, that you're shifting your decimal 2 times to the left or to the right, then I can't give you points for showing your work. So just make sure you show your work. Either way, notice though, you get 70% as your percentage. Now we can go on to the fraction. So as I look at the fraction then, I know that this, we said this said 7/10, so that fraction we'd already written down, and that's going to be 7/10. So if it's 0.7, I know that it's 1 decimal space. I know that my denominator has to have a 1 with 1 0 at the end of it. So I have 7/10 as my fraction. I have 70% as my percentage. I have both answers. I have the label. I've showed my work. I'm good to go. Well, what if I'm starting with a fraction instead? Well, if I want to go to a percent real quick, then I could say, what am I doing to 40 to get 100? Nothing, right? I can't multiply 40 evenly by something to get 100. So that really doesn't work. So let's start going to the decimal first, and then we know the easy steps of from a decimal, moving the decimal point 2 times. That should make going to the percent much easier than trying to figure it out. So they show us to go ahead and divide. Numerator, keep in mind, is my dividend. Denominator is my divisor on the outside, right? So I raise my decimal, that's got to be my first step, and then I ask, how many times does 40 go into 30? It doesn't, right? It's just 0. So that's where they're showing you to bring down the next 0. Now I have 40 going to 300. Well, 40 goes into 300 how many times? Well, that's going to be 7, because 7 times 4 is 28. Well, I add that 0 behind it. So 7 times 40 is 280. Subtract those and get 20. They bring down that next 0. 40 goes into 200 5 even times. I know that's 5 times 4 is 20, so therefore 5 times 40 is 200. I have a 0 remainder. So I have 0.075 or 75 thousandths. So changing that therefore into a percentage, so that's our decimal of 75 thousandths. Now changing that into a percentage is simply following those easy steps. I know that I'm multiplying because I'm going to go from left to right. So I'm going to move my decimal point to the right by multiplying by 100. How many times? 2 times. Why 2 times? The same reason as we said in lesson 5.2, because there's 2 zeros there. Okay? If I was multiplying by 1,000, I'd move it 3 times. If I was multiplying by 10,000, I'd move it 4 times. I'm multiplying by 10, so I'm going to move it 2 times because there's 2 zeros. Always to the right when I'm multiplying. So I move it 2 times to the right, it goes right between the 7 and the 5. So that tells me that 3/40ths, which is 0.075, 75 thousandths, is the same as 7.5 with a percent. So 7.5% or 7.5% would be the same answer. So I started with my fraction, I created my decimal, I created my percent, and I included my label. So I have 1, 2, 3 points there, and I showed work 4 points for this question. These are the type of questions you're going to see on your homework. Now we're going to do 8 of them together. All right, so follow along. Fill out your book, everyone, fill out your book step by step, showing all of your work. If there's not enough space in the front of my room, there are tablets of paper. Use the paper, it's there for you. All right, so the first thing we're going to notice is that every one of these has how many answers? Well, write the fraction or decimal as a percent. These just have one answer, right? And the answer has to have what on it to be completed as 2 points. A label, right? So I have to show work, have to have my answer, have to have my label. These are worth 3 points on your homework assignment. In order to change it to percent, we know our denominator has to be 100. So every time I have to look at it and say, okay, what can I do to my denominator to get 100? Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I'll have to divide in order to get to my percent. But on this one and this one, it's pretty easy. I can just simply multiply by something. This I multiplied by 4, therefore I have to multiply my numerator by 4. And 3 times 4 is 12. So to get my percentage, I keep my numerator and add my percent sign. 1 point, 2 point, 3 point. 3/10, same process. I know I have to get a denominator. Oh, this is what I was going to show you. If I don't want to do it this way, then I can look at it and say, oh yeah, I remember in chapter 1, we said that every fraction is division and my top number goes inside my box. So I could take my 3 divided by 25. Now I'd have to raise my decimal and put zeros there, but when I divide through, I still get 0.12 1200ths. And we said, move my decimal from left to right, 1, 2, 2 times, that would still give me my 12%. Now I can go over here. So I have 3/10. I know I have to have a denominator of what? 100, right? I already said all that. So if I need a denominator of 100, then I'm multiplying my denominator and numerator by the same number. What number am I going to use? 10, right? So if I multiply by 10, I get my 100. Therefore, my numerator is 3 times 10, which is 30. And we said we keep the numerator and just add a percent sign. In the same way, I can look at that and see that that is a fraction, and every fraction is division. So I could divide my numerator by my denominator. Numerator is always my dividend. My denominator is always my divisor. I would have to raise my decimal and then divide. I would get 0.3. But in the same way as before, we're going to move that decimal 2 times to the right to go from decimal to percent. So when I shift it 2 times, I'd have to add a 0 to it. Therefore, I move it 2 times. It's never an option. Okay? If I'm going from decimal to a percent, I have to move that decimal 2 times. If I'm going from a percent into a decimal, I have to move it 2 times. It's not once, it's not 3, it's always twice. That is still going to give me my 30% that we ended up with by doing it this way. This shows my work to get the answer. This shows my work to get the answer. The way that you do it is up to you, whichever one you're more successful with. Okay? Make sure that you have your answer. Make sure you have your label. Make sure you show work either way for your 3 points. All right, so now we go on to 3. 3 tells me to go from decimal to percent. I'm going to move it from left to right 2 times. Why? Well, because we said that we're talking about denominators of 100 when we're using a percent, and therefore I would be multiplying this by 100 to get my percent. 100 has 2 zeros on it, so I know I'm going to move it 2 times. That's why we're always moving it to the right or left 2 times, because 100 has 2 zeros on it. So if I move it 2 times, it puts it right between the 1 and the last 7, so I know I have 71.7%. Please notice, this little area right here with the 2 movements, the 2 humps, that's showing work. Okay? Now, if you want to show that you multiply by 100, you can even stack it and multiply it by 100. That would show work also. That's the easiest way to show work. But if you just go from this without any movement to that, I'm not going to give you credit for showing work. Show me that you understand that you have to move that decimal 2 times. All right? When we go to number 4, which is 0.02 or 200ths, same thing. Move it 2 times from left to right because we're going from decimal to percentage. If it was a percentage to a decimal, then I'd move it to the left 2 times. Always move it to the right 2 times because that means I'm multiplying by 100, which has 2 zeros. Take that front 0 off though. We're not going to say 0.2%. It's just 2%. All right, now let's look at this one. How many answers do you need? 2 answers, right? Because it says I need the 2 other forms. So let's look. I'm going through and I'm going to label the 2 different answers that I need. Okay, so if I have a decimal here, then that means down here I'm going to need a percent and a fraction. I have a fraction here, so I need a percent and a decimal. Fraction, need a percent and a decimal. A decimal, need a percent and a fraction. Okay? That way I know that I'm going to have both answers that I need. So we're going to have multiple points that this is worth every time. So I start with my 0.01, which is said 100th. So if I start out by taking my 100th and I go to my percent, then I'm going to move my decimal how many times? 2 times, right? Because I'm multiplying by 100 every time. If I'm multiplying, I move to the right. 100 has 2 zeros. I move it 2 times. That puts my decimal point right behind my 1. So I know that that's going to be equal to 1%. I have my first answer. I showed work. I have my number. I have my label, 3 points, but I'm not done. Now I have to do it as a fraction. So as a fraction then, I can look at this and say, well, either go from my percent, and I know that my denominator has to be 100, and I put my percent number on top. Or I can look at how I say this. How do I say that number? 100th, right? Which also says my denominator has to be 100, and therefore I put my 1 on top. Either way, it's going to be 1 over 100, which is 1/100th, and that's my fraction. Okay? So I have another point that one is worth. Number 6, I'm looking for a percent and a decimal. What am I doing to 40 to get 100 to go to my percent? Nothing, right? Can't do it. So I'm going to start with my decimal, and then I'll go to my percent. So if I start with my decimal then, I'm going to take my numerator, which is 13. Now notice I'm showing you that you're going to go out 3 different decimal positions. Okay, so sometimes we do have to go out multiple steps to get to the final answer. Has to be rounded. I can't have a mix or a decimal with a fraction on it, right? So I have to keep going. My denominator is my divisor. My first step is what on this math problem? Hopefully you thought, raise your decimal. Has to be your first step. Don't move it in any other direction other than directly up. Then I start asking my questions. Does 40 go into 1? No. Does 40 go into 13? No. Does 40 go into 130? Yes. So how many times? Well, if I put 3, because 3 times 4 is 12, right? So 3 times 40 has to be 120. That gets me pretty close. So when I subtract that, I get 10. It is smaller than 40, so I know I'm good. I'm going to bring down my 0, and 40 goes into 100. Well, that'd be 2 times, because 2 times 4 is 8. So 2 times 40 is going to be my 80. That gives me a remainder of 20. I bring down my next 0, and 4 and 5 make 20. So 40 times 5 has to be 200. All right? That gives me my 0 remainder. That's where I need to be. So as a decimal, I have 0.325, which is 325 thousandths. Now, can I change that into a percent? Sure I can. We said if I have a decimal, then I'm going to move. So I'm going to move it 2 times, right? Because it would be like having a denominator of 100, which means I'm going to move it over to the right 2 times. So if I move it to the right 2 times, that puts it right between the 2 and the 5. That gives me 32.5. 32.5 what? 32.5%. So I have to make sure that I have 32.5%. I have my label. So I have an answer, I have a label, I have another answer, and I have work. 4 points. All right, so 6 over 5. So I could multiply and get a denominator of 100. Then I'm still kind of wonky, right? I've got a larger denominator. So instead of doing that, let's start with the decimal. Let's go there first and see if there's an easier way to then change that into a percent. So I'm going to take my 6, and I'm going to divide by my denominator of 5, because that's going to be my divisor. First thing I'm going to do, again, raise my decimal up. 5 does go into 6 one time, right? That's why it's top heavy, so I know I'm going to have a whole number. So it goes in 1 time, which gives me minus 5 and 1 left over. I bring down that 0, and now I have 5 going into 10 2 times. So I get 1 and 2 tenths, or 1.2. Can I go easily into a percent now compared to this? Yeah, absolutely. So when I know that my decimal is 1 and 2 tenths, then all I have to do is move that decimal once again 2 times. Once again. Has to be 2 times, even though there's not another digit there, right? So if I move it 2 times, what do I have to add? 0, right? So I put a 0 there, which tells me that I now have 120%. If I end up with 12% compared to that, well, that's completely going to be wrong. So I got to make sure that I'm talking about 120%, which is more than 100%. So this would be like, hey, you know, on your mom or dad's December check, they got 120% compared to 100% of what they normally get because their boss gave them a bonus for Christmas. That'd be nice of them. So we have 120%. I have answer, label, answer, work. 4 points. Now we're going to take 8 thousandths, okay, and change it. So when I look at my 8 thousandths, so we're going to start by changing it into a percent. Right? So that's usually the easiest one because I know I'm going to move it from percent or decimal to percent. I'm going to move it to the right because I have to multiply by 100 because I know it's out of 100%. I'm going to move it 2 times because there's 2 zeros on my 100. So I move it twice, and then I just add my percent sign. So I know I have 0.8% or 0.8%. All right, so I'm good with that. Now, I gotta go to a fraction. So we said if I have a decimal in my fraction, then I still am going to put it over a denominator of what? 100, right? Because that's what percents are out of. So if I have 0.8 over 100, then this was 5.2, and a couple of you got confused on that. I have to start by getting a whole number in my numerator. I can't leave a decimal in the top. Well, I only have to move the decimal one time, so that means I just multiply by 10. But if I multiply the top by 10, I have to multiply the bottom by 10. So that does allow me to shift that decimal one time. So I get 8, and then 10 with another 0 on it, or excuse me, 100 with another 0 on it, or multiplying by 10 is 1,000. School should be starting, but it's a snow day. So this says 8 1,000ths. What did I say this was? Well, if we say that correctly, that still says 8 1,000ths, right? So I could have started just by writing it as a fraction instead of going through this step if I know my decimal place value and I can say that correctly. So that saves you a step if you know your decimal place value. Either way, when I see 8 1,000ths, I can tell that I can reduce that fraction. And all of my fraction answers have to be reduced down to the lowest form that I can get. So what will go into both of those numbers? This is where your handy dandy calculator is important on this lesson. So I can see that 2 goes into both of them because they're even. But then I still end up with an even number, don't I? So what if I reduce by 4? Will 4 go into 1,000? I know it would go into 8 2 times, right? So if I take 1,000 and divide it by 4, I still get an even number. Does that mean that 8 will go into 1,000? Well, if I have my calculator, 1 divided by 8, it does go in even. So I have to reduce that by 8s. So I reduce both numerator and denominator by 8, which is going to give me 1 over 125. Sorry, this kind of covered it up there. But my final answer is 1 over 125. That would be said 1 125ths, which we normally don't say, so that's why we usually just say 1 over 125. All right, so it's not a difficult lesson, but there are a lot of steps to it. And it's simply really, truly just taking your time and making sure you go to the steps. And if you don't remember the steps, that's fine, because we just worked through like 14 problems showing step by step by step how to go from each form into the other two. So just go back and look at your book. Now, if you sat there, you stared off into space, your book's not filled in, then I need you to rewind, okay? Go back, watch it, fill in your book so that you have things to look at. I'll be working with people in the back of the room, still making some corrections and then reteaching some things that some of them forgot. I need you to do one, or it should be 2 through 15 because one's already done for you. It's a free point. Now 15, I've explained multiple times how to answer that question on this video. So hopefully you did pay attention, but you do have to do the written response on number 15. And then on the review part on page 286, you're going to do questions 1 through 6.